All right, thank you so much, Lisa. Now I'd like to introduce Michael Condon, who will be moderating a discussion on men in the middle. This is regarding kind of the relationship and what sort of strain it puts on it when you're dealing with issues of trying to build your family. Michael is a clinical adult psychologist with 35 years experience. He's assisted with both traditional and gestational surrogacy arrangements. Michael has seen both success and failure, and he enjoys helping people along through their process. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everybody. I suppose one of the things about going through a surrogacy journey, no matter who you are, is it's a long journey. If you're a couple, a heterosexual couple or a same-sex couple in terms of females, you may be looking at surrogacy because of various reasons, an absent uterus, or looking at there's been miscarriages, there's been damage to the uterus, or for a myriad of other reasons. If you're obviously a same-sex male couple, there's obviously a lack of uterus, and unfortunately there aren't only one Arnie in the world, so it's really looking at still a long journey though. I think what's also been said is that it's a hard journey for everybody. And also you need to look at, as everybody said, what state regulations are, what the country regulations are. I mean, Australia varies hugely in its surrogacy laws. For example, if I'm seeing someone in Victoria, I virtually have to drag every single thing about their history out of them. They've got to go through an ethics committee approval, etc, etc, etc. Whereas in Queensland, where I am, basically, provided they've had counselling, provided they've had legal advice, provided they've done a surrogacy arrangement, then they can either get pregnant by IVF, they can get pregnant by a shag on a Saturday night. There's no difference from a legal point of view. So it is very, very different. And I think everybody's got their individual journeys. But one of the things, unfortunately, is that it is a journey. I often find in terms of IVF counselling that people start off obviously bright and cheerful and hopeful, and for many people they go away bright and cheerful and satisfied with either the baby or the children they have. For some people, unfortunately, that journey continues onwards and onwards and onwards. And where do you call the line? Where do you look at egg donation? Where do you look at sperm donation? Where do you look at embryo donation? Or where do you look at surrogacy? Because it doesn't work and we don't damn know why. One of the people who gets caught in the middle, obviously, tends to be males, because of the simple thing that males like fixing things, and needless to say, if it's not working, you can't fix it. And that's a pretty frustrating thing for most males, and that's probably where you two have been. But the other things about males is, look, generally when I see people, it's usually, after a long term of infertility, it's usually the female who's the driver. Sometimes it's the male, but it's usually the female. But more particularly, it's usually the male who's looking at the checkbook and looking at what the cost is, and also looking at their wife deteriorate in terms of their coping strategies and everything like that. For most couples, it actually brings them close together. For a small number of couples, it rips them apart. But what I'd like to do is introduce our two speakers. We've got Mark here, oops, over there, my apologies, sorry. He's a good-looking one. They've gone through overseas. They have a child called Anika, who's a 7-year-old. Learned lots about the pros and cons of it all, and also egg donation, India, etc. So, and then we've got Michael. We've heard from Michael's wife earlier on today. 80 eggs retrieved, 45 embryos transferred. I would have said as a counsellor, get the bloody hell out of there and do something else way before they probably did, no offence. But that's easy to say from my perspective as a counsellor when I'm not sort of got that full emotional involvement of going through it. And needless to say, you have obviously come from Victoria where you need an ethics committee to approve things. Thankfully, that doesn't apply in everywhere, as I've already said. And I do know people who have actually moved states just because they'll go through one surrogacy law versus another surrogacy law. And you know, I just find it quite amazing that some people can live at Tweed Heads and some people can live at Coolangatta. The distance between them is about 1/2 kilometre, but they're regulated by totally different laws, and I really think we should have a commonality of laws across Australia. We can't have an Australian law, that's not going to work, but there needs to be a commonality. However, I fear that that commonality might go down to the lowest common denominator, and it might be difficult for everybody on an ongoing basis. But anyway, I'd like to introduce, who'd like to go first?
Participate.
Fine.
Go for it, you go.
I think Michael just sort of summed up a lot of good things there. You know, I think when you said, Michael, you know, some couples stay together, some others it sort of rips them apart. I think we got ripped apart, but we're still together. You know, in terms of summary there. But you know, if you try and put it in balance, you know, we started down the road of IVF in 1988, so it's quite some time ago with Sydney IVF. You know, what I can say is that, you know, when you join as a couple, you know, this is not advice, but you know, I look at it from a male perspective. And most people sort of join, you know, find a partner, you know, and you know, the intention of that sort of partnership comes together initially is love, respect, you know, want to live your life together. You know, and it's important to maintain that concept in your mind when you're going through sort of difficult times, because often what happens as a couple, you're in a situation where, you know, you love each other. Children is something that most people naturally want to have, but it is an addition to the family, to the sort of unity that you created in the first place. And men do see it sort of very differently, you know, to females, as I've come to learn. The most important thing, if you're a couple, you know, male and female heterosexual couple, I mean, if you're a single person, you know, trying to have a child, you know, or a gay couple trying to have children, I mean, most people are here for the same reason. They've come together as a result of their unity and their love, and now they'd like to extend that love through a child. You know, for the couples that are here that already have children, that they'd like to actually extend that family but can't naturally, I mean, I think first of all, you're very fortunate to have children in the first place. You know, you're sort of unique in this sort of in this room in many respects. You know, and often you've got to sort of be thankful for what you do have. You know, maybe for not what you can't have at times. So if you try and put that sort of as the foundation, you know, I know when we first commenced through Sydney IVF, it's sort of an interesting story. You know, we first commenced at Sydney IVF in 1988. I think I was living in Newcastle at the time. My wife was living in Sydney. You know, I was on a sort of project or an assignment with work at the time, and I mean, most people thought, oh, it's because you guys are too far away. But you know, what they discovered was that, you know, the sperm that I had, you know, needed a kick in the ring to sort of get themselves going, or woken up in the morning to get themselves started. They weren't sort of as you know, the motility wasn't as great. You know, they found that my wife Renata, some of you may know the story, you know, had endometriosis, quite severe. You know, needed a fair bit of laparoscopic surgery at the time. You know, further on they found that you know, she had a small sort of benign tumour in her uterus. So, you know, from from Sydney IVF's perspective, obviously our chances became very slim. You know, but you know, my wife was very persistent about the concept of having children. You know, having children for me usually meant, in those days, you know, when we were going through Sydney IVF, you know, having children for me meant usually getting locked up in a cubicle somewhere with a Penthouse magazine, you know, and jacking off into a little sort of bucket like that just to make sure that we could try and have children somehow. The worst part about it actually in those days was I had the most gorgeous scientists sitting outside that room that you had to sort of give that vial to. I just can't work out why the hell there was, you know, these gorgeous little sort of, you know, scientists sort of, you know, checking out the sperm at the time. But, you know, sort of, it's a bit, you know, the only good thing in those days actually, which you'll never get away with nowadays, right, is in those days they had like a little bottle of scotch in the corner on the table. And I thought, that's fantastic, you know. You know, that at Sydney IVF they would actually, you know, Dr. Ian Hill would give us this little bottle of scotch to go for. I wasn't much of a scotch drinker, unfortunately. But, you know, to help sort of sedate the nerves, it was, you know, fantastic at the time. It was probably more to sedate the nerves when you gave that little sort of flask to the good-looking scientist sort of across from the room, when she looked at you and you just knew she was thinking, I just know what you've been up to. You know, so I became a bit of a, you know, I think as Michael said earlier, we were, you know, we went through the process of not only just in Australia, but we ended up in America, we ended up in India. So I became a bit of a jerk-off freak, travelling the globe for a while there. So, you make a lot of these things, but we first of all, the story was that we went through, with my wife, we went through Sydney IVF. A very good clinic, fantastic. I think they've changed their name nowadays. I think they're a listed sort of business or something. But they were fantastic through the 80s and the early 90s. But we had some dozen transfers unsuccessfully. Created some reasonably good embryos, but our chance of success, were very slim for a number of different reasons relevant to, my wife's sort of circumstances with the uterus. In 1999, Renata had to have a hysterectomy, but they retained her ovaries in the hope that by retaining the ovaries we'd still be able to extract some eggs and still create some embryos, with the hope that we might be able to then, transfer those into a surrogate. In fact, a friend of ours approached us about actually doing exactly that, and we went through the ethics committee in New South Wales, and back then we had sort of quite a road to travel. Unsuccessfully, however, because the quality of the embryos we created were not of the sufficient standard to transfer to anybody else. So then we had a friend of ours who was actually a pilot, a stewardess, that approached us and said they had a friend, who had had a child, a young girl, through surrogacy in the United States, and I thought we should check that out, and particularly, Renata. At the time we went through, when we sort of got to a point where we knew we couldn't have children together, we went through sort of independent counselling and sort of together counselling. At the time I sort of thought from a male perspective, I could actually live my life, without children. I thought I could get through, my life thinking that, I love my wife, I love her enough to sort of think I could actually live my life this way. We had a pretty good lifestyle at the time. We'd been sort of successful in business and sort of property and a number of other things, and I thought we could do that. But from my wife's point of view, that was just never going to happen. And from Renata's point of view, she sort of kept at me. And for those people that are in the room, sort of on the fence about whether you should or whether you shouldn't, I got to tell you, and for most parents, sort of that are here, I think most of you would agree that you would never be without your children, for any circumstance, once you've had them. But we went through sort of that entire sort of cycle. Went to I rung up a number of phone calls into the United States, and I remember I was speaking to a lady called Jenny Vleedstra, who was actually recommended to us at the time. She was an independent sort of operator over there, quite very good, had very successful sort of cases at the time. I remember ringing her and saying, how do people? And I just sort of came in the last part of that sort of previous lady's conversation about cost. When we went to America, the Australian dollar was at 49 cents. To the like we're getting 49 US cents to the Aussie dollar. So I remember sending our first cheque over there for $10,000, and we sort of, it was $4,900. I thought, Jesus, that's a drop in the ocean compared to what's about to happen. But I sort of tried to, in relation to the question of how do you cope, I sort of tried to, reason with myself at the time, thinking, I'm sort of 39 years old at the time, what might this cost? And I thought at the time, it might cost $200,000 at the time, it ended up costing us a heck of a lot more than that in the end. But at the time I thought, $200,000 in the scheme of my life, it's not a lot of money, actually, in comparison to what potentially your earnings could be. If you look at your entire life being retiring at 65, and I thought at the time, look, even if I have to retire or work till 75 or 80, it doesn't matter, So you try to put those things in perspective at the time. But we went to the States first in 2002. And we had our first transfer, I think it was January of that particular year. 5 years later, in June of 29th, we had our daughter, Annika, after about sort of 8 attempts. This is now getting the difficult part for me, right? So just excuse me for a second while I just get my head together. But, so Annika was born in 2007, thankfully. We're very grateful for that. We had an enormous journey, if I think about the fact that we started in 1989 or 88. So we had almost a 20-year journey. In fact, my wife and I, we've celebrated our 20th year of our anniversary of 20th year when we had our first child. Fantastic. So along the way, as Michael said earlier, it does create a lot of argument. There is a lot of there is a lot of reasons why, as couples, you would sort of say, what, this is just too hard. And you kind of sort of think, should we continue or should we just stay put? Why can't we just enjoy our lives as we are? Do we really need to have children? You'll go through those questions, many times over. And I hear the stories when I come here, and the stories that I hear often, the people are successful in their first time round or their second time round, and it's sort of pretty good. They haven't spent, from a financial point of view. And actually, for most of you in the room, for most of you that actually decide to proceed and do something about sort of having children through a surrogate type arrangement, for most of you, your first, second or third attempt, you'll be successful. And in fact, I'd wish that for everybody here. And financially, it won't be the greatest of burdens when you try and put your life in perspective about what's possible. We then went on and actually tried to have a sibling for Annika. We went into it sort of thinking one would just be fantastic. We'd been through so much at the time. We sort of think, one would just be fantastic. How great would it be to have siblings as twins along the way? But that wasn't to be for us. But although we did have twins, we did have twin pregnancies on a couple of occasions that we had to that unfortunately miscarried. Within their second trimester. That was regretful. But when we had Annika, we had such a fantastic life with her. We just thought it'd be great for her to have a sibling. Being older parents as we were, so this is where the Indian story came into sort of being. We had another couple of attempts in America. The Australian dollar was more favourable. We were throwing money at the problem. And I'm just about done. But I thought India might be interesting. They might have some nice videos there or magazines. But unfortunately for us, India wasn't successful. And after about sort of 5 attempts over there, we decided to sort of give that away. But the greatest story I can sort of, if I just finish up by saying, you came together as a couple, you love each other as a couple. I think the most important thing is keep that in perspective first. The children are really secondary to that. And if you can try and maintain that sort of as a perspective, I think you can only have a wonderful life. But I wish you every success in your journey on having children.
Now, if we could hear from Michael, you heard from his wife earlier on. Their journey's pretty hard as well.
Yeah, and I think what's important and what you'll hear about, I think everyone that sort of speaks about their experiences, everyone has a story, and it's all relative, and it's all pretty tough. So I think no matter where you are in the journey, I think there's something that's really important that you should just, I always take into account is what we're actually doing and what you may hear about. It's actually, apart from splitting atoms or getting embryos together, it's not actually rocket science in the way that we operate. They're the professionals that do it at the other end, and some of these things that we need to do are just what I feel is your moral duties as a partner, which is just, unfortunately, is on steroids, right? Because it's a very stressful environment, and it does go on for a long period of time, which unfortunately means that it does bring on a lot of duress, a lot of distress, and unfortunately, in a lot of circumstances, a lot of depression and anxiety. So it's not unusual for that to take place. In fact, who wouldn't be depressed if they're in a situation where they really want to have children, and it's taken them so long to have children, and they're in the situation that they're in at the moment. So that's just normal, and that's what I think I really like everyone to understand. It's when you're in these situations, it is very normal. I take on your early comment, and I think about how boring life would be if I was able to just have that shag on a Saturday night and have a little baby, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. I must laugh, as you heard from Chelsea, my wife, a little bit earlier. We finally had our little baby girl Matilda, who's now almost 2 years old, 2 years ago obviously, but after a long journey, and I reflected back on a comment from my father-in-law when he was joking at the time, and he looked at me sort of when we were getting married. He goes, "Don't you have sex with my daughter?" And I could almost look back and say, well, technically I really didn't have to have sex with your daughter, because firstly we had donor eggs, we had donor sperms, and we had a surrogate, so technically we were just project managers. So something I take out of what Mark said, which I think is very important, is Australians are very good at this, and I take full advantage of it. Take the piss out of yourself, right? Have a bit of a laugh. Have a bit of a laugh about what you're going through, because you really have to. Like, Chelsea and I have great laughs about, we called our team that put together Matilda Project Pelican, because we used to always see that pelican with that sort of the thing that used to carry the baby, and we weren't really a part of it. So I encourage you all that, because it's very serious and it will go on for potentially a long period of time, but just spend some time having a bit of a laugh about what goes on. I'd love to sort of stand up here and say that there's a silver bullet to how to deal with it. And I think you just need to assess the situation that you're in and react where necessary. And look, I did put together a few notes, and as I was putting together these notes, I realised I was just recounting the circumstance that I went through over the 10 odd years to having Matilda, and I basically wrote down the exact opposite of what I think you should probably do. And so learn from my experience is probably not what I actually did. One of the big things that I know that we spoke about in part of this session is about sort of when one of your parties doesn't want to keep going. Look, I was quite fortunate in the fact, and I look at it this way, that both Chelsea and I, we wanted to continue to keep going. As you can see, we went through a lot, and we just persevered and persevered. And yeah, nothing was really going to get in our way, I'd have to say. So it's very important that if somebody is possibly not on the same path, you really sit back and have a conversation with them about it. And of course, this journey will, as sort of Mark spoke about, it'll bring a hairline fracture into a break and a break into a sever. It really does compound situations that are in your life. You'll experience life as a partner very quickly in quite a compounded period of time. Something that you said, Michael, which is again very much a male thing and very much I think an Australian male thing, is we really try to fix it. Don't do it, we can't fix it. So don't try and fix it. A word I used to use with my wife, and Chelsea now clouts me on the back of the head when I say it, is sometimes it's good just to listen, which is not rocket science again. If you're not too sure what to say the word "it sounds serious." Just say it sounds serious. It really does, because if you don't know what else to say, just say it, because it is, and it just allows you to sort of get in the moment to talk to them about it. And if things get really bad, and we experience some very bad times, I sort of step back and sort of think, in hindsight, how would I want to respond as a partner to my wife when she's going through a very sort of emotional and severe time? And sorry, I get a bit emotional as well. And I just remember thinking the main thing that I just tried to do when I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say, and didn't know how to say it, I just to bear hug my wife and just go, "I love you." And she might have been screaming or yelling or something, and I just used to bear hug her again and go, "I just love you, I just love you, I just love you." And I did that for a long period of time, and you won't get don't expect it to be, "Oh, thank you, now I know you love me, everything's okay." It won't be. But it's just that constant reassurance. So you're not trying to fix it, and you're just trying to tell them how you feel and where you are in the journey. So that's something that I actually did after a little while, and it seemed to work quite well. Another thing is about grieving. I think you'll both parties, or whoever's involved in this process, you'll go through emotional times and you will need to grieve. And unfortunately, you're not genetically the same people, so you will grieve very differently as couples. So something that Chelsea and I learnt very quickly is let ourselves grieve as we do as individuals, and then we came together to grieve together, because sometimes, my wife Chelsea used to grieve in hard and fast early. I had a bit of a long tail. I'm a little bit slow in the family. So I used to grieve a little bit slower and a little bit later. So that's one other point. And another thing which came out, which is a really big thing, talk to your family, talk to your friends about it, talk to them early, and don't be surprised about how they'll respond to it, because it will be comforting and warming. And I reflect back on it, and I remember I actually am originally from Sydney, but I'm sort of based in Melbourne now. And whenever I'm back here with work, I catch up with a couple of my university colleagues, and we catch up, and at one session I just sort of let it all out and just told them all about it, and they were just a bit dumbfounded. Some of them did know about it. But I just got a phenomenal support. Subsequently, and as us males do, almost every time we catch up, somebody actually talks about their feelings, about what they're going through. So we now have this bond about talking about our feelings and how we are, and it's very helpful and it's very supportive. And probably another thing is, as a couple, you may go through different phases when you're going through this. As Mark said, it's a long journey. You're going to probably going to be living until about 96 years of age. This is going to be a very intense period in your life. And one of the partners will inevitably be looking very short term and head down. And I sort of try to take the role that I'll try and take the opposite. And so if we're in the moment, we're worried about what's going to happen with this embryo or this surrogacy arrangement or this transfer, and for the 20th time or 30th time, try to look up and sort of think, but the bigger picture here is what we're trying to aspire, and our aspirations here, which just allows you not to get too caught up in the moment and make silly decisions. And sometimes decisions are best made the following day.
So I just want to see, because we're out of time, and
Sorry.
I want to see if there's anybody who has questions at this point. Just to leave a couple minutes.
What I'd like to do is invite people to catch up with Michael or Mark during afternoon tea if you wish to, and I'd like to thank them both for sharing their stories. Males aren't good at sharing stories, and I think you've both done very, very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.